The Roman legionnaires were the most fearsome warriors throughout the ancient world. But what kind of foods fueled them along the way? What were the meals that sustained these men as they marched across 3 continents, conquering the known world along the way? These men weren't just soldiers, though. They were unstoppable forces of nature who crushed Gallic tribes, decimated Germanic armies, and brought mighty Carthage to its knees. They built roads through impossible terrain, erected fortified camps in a single day, and marched 20 miles in full armor while carrying 60 pounds of gear. For over 4 centuries, these bronze-clad titans dominated battlefields from the misty shores of Britain to the scorching deserts of Egypt. They created the greatest military machine the ancient world had ever seen, conquering civilizations that had stood for centuries and bending entire nations to Rome's will. How exactly did these almighty warriors accomplish all this? What foods sustained their legendary strength and endurance? What did the men who conquered the known world actually eat? Welcome back to Ancient Rome Revisited. Today, I'm taking you inside the mess halls and cooking fires of Rome's legions to uncover the shocking truth about their daily diet. You'll discover that their breakfast was tougher than concrete, that their midday meals could break your teeth, as well as the secret ingredients that made these meals edible. Believe me, some of these ingredients will make you gag. But stick around until the end, because I'll reveal how Roman soldiers sometimes resorted to eating their own leather boots to survive, and why that might have actually saved the empire many times over. Breakfast, the army's first meal of the day. Picture this. It's dawn in a Roman military camp somewhere along the Germanic frontier, around 100 AD. The sun is barely peeking over the horizon, and already you can hear the clatter of bronze pots and the scraping of wooden spoons. No, this isn't some fancy breakfast buffet. This is how the world's most disciplined army started their day. And it's about to blow your mind. Let me tell you something right off the bat. Roman soldiers didn't wake up to eggs Benedict or avocado toast. In fact, their morning meal was so basic, it would make a college student's ramen diet look gourmet. But here's the kicker. This simple breakfast helped them march 20 miles a day in full armor and still have energy to build a fortified camp before sunset. So what exactly did these legendary warriors eat to kickstart their day? Brace yourself for this. It was basically ancient oatmeal, but not the kind you'd find in a cozy breakfast nook. We're talking about palmentum, a thick porridge made from whatever grains they could get their hands on. Wheat, barley, millet. If it could be ground into flour and mixed with water, it was breakfast. Now, I know what you're thinking. Porridge? That's it? That's what conquered Gaul and built an empire that lasted over 1,000 years. But stick with me here, because this wasn't your grandmother's oatmeal. This stuff was dense, filling, and packed with carbohydrates that would fuel a soldier through hours of marching, drilling, and potentially fighting for their lives. The consistency was somewhere between modern oatmeal and concrete, thick enough that you could practically stand a spoon in it. Imagine trying to eat wallpaper paste that's been sitting out for an hour, and you're getting close to the texture. Not exactly appetizing by today's standards, but when you're carrying 60 pounds of gear and facing a day of hard labor, calories are calories. But here's where it gets interesting. They didn't eat this gray mush plain. Roman soldiers were surprisingly creative with their seasonings. They'd mix in whatever they had on hand. A bit of salt, if they were lucky. Some herbs they'd foraged. Maybe a drizzle of olive oil if supplies were good. Think of it like the ancient equivalent of trying to jazz up instant ramen with whatever you can find in your kitchen at 2 a.m. Sometimes, if they were really living it up, they'd throw in some lard or bacon fat. Yes, you heard that right. Bacon for breakfast was a thing even back then. The Romans knew what they were about. This would transform their bland porridge into something that actually had flavor and provided the kind of fat content that would keep them satisfied for hours. The soldiers would gather around their cooking fires in groups of 8, called a contubernium, sharing the same tent and the same meals. Picture it like an ancient fraternity house, except instead of beer pong, they practiced sword drills, and instead of pizza delivery, they had military rations. Each group took turns with cooking duties, so every soldier had to learn the basics of field cooking, whether they wanted to or not. Now you might be wondering about drinks. Forget your morning coffee or energy drinks. Roman soldiers started their day with something called posca, essentially watered-down wine mixed with vinegar. I know it sounds absolutely revolting. But think about it from a practical standpoint. This mixture was acidic enough to kill bacteria in questionable water sources, provided some calories, and gave just enough of an alcohol kick to take the edge off another day in the legions. The taste. Imagine mixing cheap wine with salad dressing and then watering it down until it's barely recognizable. It was sour, sharp, and probably made your face pucker like you'd bitten into a lemon. But it was safe to drink, which in an age before water treatment plants was no small thing. Plus, it was better than the alternative. Dysentery wasn't exactly compatible with military effectiveness. After this breakfast that would make a modern nutritionist weep, the soldiers would begin their daily routine. But don't think for a moment that they were done eating for a while. The Roman military understood something that modern armies still grapple with. Hungry soldiers are ineffective soldiers. So they built regular meal breaks into their daily schedule. Mid-morning snacks. Around mid-morning, usually during a brief rest in their marching routine, soldiers would break out what we might call their ancient energy bars. These were called bucellatum, basically hardtack biscuits that were baked until they were harder than a hockey puck and about as appetizing. Think of the most stale crackers you've ever encountered. Multiply that by 10, and you're getting close. These biscuits were designed for one thing: longevity. They could last for months without spoiling, which made them perfect for long campaigns where fresh supplies might be hard to come by. The downside: they were so hard they could chip your teeth. Soldiers would often soak them in their posca or water just to make them chewable. It was like eating cardboard that had been left out in the rain, then dried in the sun for a week. But here's the brilliant part. These weren't just random crackers. They were fortified with salt, sometimes herbs, and occasionally even a bit of meat or cheese mixed into the dough before baking. The Romans had essentially invented the protein bar 2,000 years before power bars hit the market. Sure, they tasted like salted cardboard, but they provided essential nutrients and could be eaten on the march without stopping for a proper meal break. Lunchtime in the Roman army. The real meal of the day, their equivalent of lunch, came around midday. And this is where things get interesting. This meal was called prandium, and it was when Roman soldiers actually got something that resembled real food. We're talking bread, cheese, sometimes meat, and whatever vegetables they could scrounge up or buy from local farmers. The bread was the foundation of this meal, and I'm not talking about Wonder Bread here. Roman military bread was dense, dark, and made from coarse flour that included plenty of fiber. Think of it like a really rustic artisanal loaf, except instead of costing $12 at a fancy bakery, it was mass-produced in military ovens by soldiers who learned baking as part of their basic training. Each soldier was entitled to about 2 pounds of bread per day. That might not sound like much, but this wasn't light, fluffy bread. This was dense, filling stuff that would stick to your ribs. The equivalent today would be like eating several thick slices of pumpernickel or rye bread, substantial enough to keep you going through hours of physical labor. The cheese was usually hard and aged. Think of a cross between Parmesan and cheddar that had been sitting around for months. It was salty, sharp, and probably strong enough to smell from across the camp. But it provided protein and fat, and more importantly, it didn't spoil quickly in the heat. Soldiers would shave off chunks with their knives and eat it alongside their bread, creating the ancient equivalent of a grilled cheese sandwich, except without the grilling. When meat was available, and that was a big when, it was usually preserved pork or beef. We're talking about the original beef jerky here, except imagine jerky that was saltier than the Dead Sea and tougher than leather boots. The meat was preserved through heavy salting and sometimes smoking, which meant it could last for weeks without refrigeration, but required some serious jaw work to consume. The soldiers would often rehydrate this preserved meat by throwing it into a pot with water and whatever vegetables they had on hand, creating a stew that was the ancient ancestor of military MREs. The result was a salty, protein-rich mixture that provided essential nutrients, but probably tasted like someone had boiled shoe leather with grass clippings. Vegetables were a luxury that depended entirely on where they were stationed and what the local economy could provide. In fertile regions, soldiers might get onions, garlic, leeks, or even some greens. These weren't just for flavor. The Romans understood, even if they didn't know the science behind it, that eating varied foods kept their soldiers healthier. But here's where Roman military logistics gets really impressive. They didn't just rely on local food sources. The Roman army had a supply chain that would make Amazon jealous. Supply trains followed the legions, carrying everything from grain to olive oil to the precious garum, a fermented fish sauce that was basically the ketchup of the ancient world. Garum deserves its own explanation, because it was everywhere in Roman cuisine, including military food. Imagine the funkiest, most pungent fish sauce you can think of. Now multiply that intensity by about 5. This stuff was made by fermenting fish guts and salt in the Mediterranean sun for months until it became a liquid that could probably strip paint. The Romans put it on everything, the way we use hot sauce or soy sauce today. To modern palates, garum would probably be revolting. It was incredibly salty, fishy, and had a smell that could clear a room. But it provided essential amino acids and added flavor to otherwise bland military rations. Plus, the salt content meant it never spoiled, making it perfect for military campaigns. Mid-afternoon snacks. The afternoon meal was usually lighter, more of a snack, really. Soldiers might have some dried fruit if they were lucky, maybe some nuts, or more of that beloved hardtack. This wasn't really a structured meal so much as grabbing whatever was available to keep energy levels up through the afternoon, training or marching. But the big meal, the one that really mattered, was dinner, or cena. This was when Roman soldiers actually sat down together and had something approaching a real meal. And this is where you start to see why the Roman army was so effective. They understood that morale was tied directly to food quality. Dinner time. Dinner was a communal affair. Those same 8-man tent groups would gather around their cooking fires, pooling their rations and whatever local ingredients they'd managed to acquire. This wasn't just about nutrition. It was about building the kind of unit cohesion that would keep soldiers fighting for each other when things got desperate. The centerpiece of dinner was usually a stew called pulmentum, but not the bland breakfast version. The dinner pulmentum was where Roman soldiers got creative. They'd take their basic grain base and throw in whatever protein they had. Preserved meat, fresh meat if they'd been hunting or had made a good deal with local farmers. Maybe some eggs if they were near a settlement. Vegetables went in too. Onions for flavor, leeks for substance, whatever greens they could forage. The result was a thick, hearty stew that would be familiar to anyone who's ever made a one-pot meal. Think of it like an ancient version of beef stew, except the beef might be preserved pork, the potatoes were grain porridge, and the seasoning was whatever they could find. The cooking process was a communal effort. One soldier would tend the fire, another would do the chopping, someone else would stir the pot. It was like a very primitive version of a cooking show, except instead of trying to impress judges, they were trying to create something edible enough to maintain morale in hostile territory. Seasoning was where individual creativity came into play. Some soldiers became known for their ability to make military rations actually taste good. They'd trade with locals for herbs and spices, forage for wild plants, or carefully hoard small amounts of salt and oil to transform basic ingredients into something approaching actual cuisine. The bread at dinner was often fresher than what they had for lunch, assuming they were in a permanent camp where the baker soldiers could work their ovens regularly. Sometimes they'd even make a primitive pizza-like dish, spreading olive oil and herbs on flat bread and heating it over the coals, the ancient world's answer to take-out food. Wine was a bigger part of dinner, though it was still mixed with water. The ratio varied depending on supply and the commanding officer's attitude toward discipline, but generally it was about 1 part wine to 2 or 3 parts water. This provided some calories, helped with morale, and made the water safer to drink, but wasn't strong enough to seriously impact military readiness. The social and cultural significance of meals. The social aspect of these dinner gatherings can't be overstated. This was when soldiers shared stories, complained about their officers, planned for the next day, and built the personal relationships that would keep them alive in battle. It was like a nightly team-building exercise, except the stakes were life and death rather than corporate efficiency. But what about special occasions? Even the Roman military understood that morale required occasional treats. During festivals, victories, or visits from important officials, the regular rations would be supplemented with better food. Fresh meat, better wine, maybe some honey for dessert. The ancient equivalent of catering being brought in for a company party. These special meals were a big deal. Imagine being on a diet of porridge, hardtack, and preserved meat for months, then suddenly getting fresh roasted pork, decent wine, and maybe even some exotic delicacies that had been shipped in from across the empire. It was enough to make grown soldiers cry with joy. The logistics of feeding the Roman army were staggering when you really think about it. We're talking about supplying hundreds of thousands of soldiers across an empire that stretched from Britain to the Middle East. Each legion needed tons of grain every month, plus all the other supplies that kept soldiers fed and fighting. The Romans solved this through a combination of local procurement and long-distance supply chains. Soldiers in Gaul might be eating grain grown in Egypt, seasoned with garum made in Spain, and drinking wine from Italy. It was globalization 1,500 years before the term was invented. But supply lines could be cut, local sources could dry up, and sometimes soldiers had to make do with whatever they could find. This is when Roman military ingenuity really showed. Soldiers learned to forage for edible plants, hunt local game, and even resort to siege rations that would make modern survival food look gourmet. During the siege of Masada, Roman soldiers reportedly ate leather, bark, and anything else that might provide calories. During winter campaigns in Germany, they learned to dig for roots and strip bark from trees to supplement their rations. It wasn't pretty, but it kept them alive and fighting. Health impact of the Roman army's diet. The health impacts of this diet were actually pretty remarkable. Despite eating what we'd consider a pretty monotonous and basic diet, Roman soldiers were generally healthier than the civilian population. The regular meals, physical activity, and access to at least some variety of foods meant that military service could actually improve a man's nutritional status. Of course, there were problems too. Scurvy from lack of fresh vegetables, digestive issues from the coarse bread and preserved meat, and probably constant hunger despite regular meals. But compared to the feast or famine existence of many civilians, military rations provided a reliable, if basic, source of nutrition. The psychological impact of military food culture went beyond just nutrition. Sharing meals created bonds, learning to cook built practical skills, and the reliability of regular rations provided a sense of security in an uncertain world. For many soldiers, the military was the first time in their lives they'd had guaranteed meals every day. Looking back at Roman military food culture, it's striking how many of their solutions to feeding large numbers of people in challenging conditions are still relevant today. Preserved foods, communal cooking, portable nutrition, supply chain management, these are all things modern militaries still grapple with. The next time you complain about cafeteria food or a bad meal at a restaurant, remember the Roman soldier choking down his morning porridge, gnawing on hardtack that could break teeth, and trying to make preserved meat edible. They conquered most of the known world on that diet, built roads that lasted centuries, and created a military tradition that influenced armies for the next 2,000 years. So the shocking truth about Roman army food. It wasn't shocking at all. It was practical, efficient, and designed to keep soldiers alive and fighting rather than to please their palates. It was military rations optimized for nutrition, longevity, and logistics rather than taste. And somehow, it worked well enough to build an empire that we're still talking about today. The Roman military understood something that's still true. An army marches on its stomach, but it doesn't need to march on gourmet cuisine. Sometimes, the most important ingredient in any meal is simply reliability. Knowing that no matter what else happens, you'll have food to fuel another day of facing whatever challenges come your way. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed this video, then you're also going to enjoy this other video that looks at 12 street foods found in ancient Rome. Believe me, one of these street foods is absolutely disgusting, and you won't believe that the Romans actually ate it. But it's true, they really did eat this one particular street food, which I'm sure will make you gag much, like some of the foods that we explored in this video. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.